So Australia has a housing crisis. What are we going to do about it? I'm Eliza Owen, and for my entire professional career, I've been researching Australia's housing market. The housing market just kind of keeps me up at night. I don't know. So here we are. I think the fundamental problem with Australia's housing is that prices have outpaced income over time. If you think about the median dwelling value in Australia right now, it's about $912,000. If you were to comfortably service a mortgage on that at the current level of mortgage rates, you'd need an income of over $160,000. The median wage earner in Australia is just over $100,000 a year. Incomes have only gone up about 20% over the past 20 years, whereas rents have gone up around 40% in the same period. For first homeowners in particular, if they're trying to keep up with those rising rents and save for a deposit on housing prices which are rising rapidly, I guess they've got it the toughest in terms of achieving their goal. So that means that the housing market in terms of ownership has become less accessible and more reserved for people on high income and who come from wealthy families. That creates problems within itself. A lack of home ownership over time means you get more people stuck in the private rental market, so you get more competition for rentals. And then at the very bottom of the income spectrum, you actually get really vulnerable households who fall out of the private rental market. And there's been a decline in the development of social housing. If you go back to the 1980s, about 9% of new dwelling approvals were for government housing. It's only about 2% through the 2020s. If we up the increase of social housing, not only do you broaden the safety net for low-income households in the private rental market and address the most critical part of our housing situation, but you also increase competition for the private rental market, which could ease pressures there as well. If you have wealthy parents, if you inherit housing, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to get into the market. And if that's not created equally, then we get a more unequal housing system. So there are some economists that advocate for things like inheritance tax and distributing the wealth from that tax equally among younger people. But until we consciously move towards that system, I think we risk a housing market that just gets more and more unequal. So over the past few years, this question has come up of, well, if you can't afford in a major capital city, should you just go and move regionally? And the fact is that that kind of did happen through the COVID period as we saw the rise of remote work. And the result was that regional Australia has now become just as unaffordable as the capital cities. If you look at the dwelling value to income ratio, across the combined capital cities, it's about 8.2. Now, for regions, it is 8.1. So when it comes to affordability, there's really not much difference. And just telling people to move away to find housing that suits them, it's not an option. You really need to be addressing the housing crisis properly and not just telling people more and more that they need to adapt. So when we think about the big contributors to the housing crisis we have, people often characterize it in terms of supply and demand. But that's really vague. What does it actually mean? On the supply side, we haven't been great at supplying new housing. So Sydney and Melbourne, for their size, for example, are some of the least dense in the world. Within 30 kilometres of the Sydney CBD, about 80% of residential land is only zoned for up to 3 stories high, and it's 87% of land in Melbourne. So we could afford to build up our cities more to increase supply. People might want a solution to the housing crisis, but just not in their own backyard. NIMBYism is this idea of not in my backyard. It's the idea that people in a community are rejecting the idea of higher density housing. They might rightly be concerned about, more traffic in their area or a high apartment building obstructing their views. And the main problem with NIMBYism is the way that it's influenced at a local government level. So the people that are making decisions about new housing are not the people that would benefit from that new housing. And that says to me that we kind of need to restructure the way that we organise upzoning and where dwellings can go across the country. And also the productivity of housing construction has declined when you account for the kinds of bigger, better homes we're building. For every hour worked, we're now producing 12% less housing. And in the face of all these demand side incentives, that continues to push prices higher as well. I think there's one other important aspect, and that's not just the supply of housing, but how we utilise the supply of housing that we have. If you think about Australia's population, we've got about 27 million people in this country. If you assume an average household size of 2.5 people, that's about the current average, then technically you'd need 10,800,000 dwellings. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, we actually have 11.4 million dwellings. There's vacant property out there that's not being utilised, and addressing that would help to address the housing issues we have as well. Helping retirees to downsize is something that would make the housing market more efficient. You'd have less young families struggling to find a home that's big enough for them and their kids, but that's a very tricky thing to try and tackle. You'd have to make changes to the way that houses are counted towards the pension, change the way that we tax property, maybe remove stamp duty so that it's easier for older Australians to buy their next dwelling, and also provide something for them to downsize into. And that comes back to the density piece as well, making sure that there is actually townhouses, apartments, and dwellings that are fit for older Australians to move into if they choose to move out of the family home. In terms of overseas migration and the housing market, fundamentally, if you have more people coming from overseas, then you're increasing the amount of dwellings that we need to house them. The problem with using migration as a lever to affect the housing market is that it could actually have detrimental effects. Skilled migration in particular contributes so much to the economy. 2021 was the biggest single calendar year of growth in Australia's housing market going back to the 1980s, when values went up about 25%. And it was also a year that was largely defined by no overseas migration. We had closed the borders because of COVID. I think that is a really pivotal point in demonstrating that it's not the only factor, and it can actually be a pretty dangerous lever to pull when it comes to the housing crisis. There is the potential for property values in Australia to just keep rising, even if fewer individuals can afford them. For example, overseas, they have a setup for big companies to own properties and rent them out. This is known as institutional investment in housing, or build to rent models. And to be honest, Australia is sort of opening up that door a little bit as well. If we don't watch this carefully, there may actually be more company ownership of property. At the end of the day, we're treating property and land as an asset that accrues value, and that's always going to keep attracting investment. If you look at the demand side of things, we've been treating property more as an investment over time as opposed to something to live in. So the idea of housing as an investment attracts an additional layer of demand and interest that bids property prices higher. That's reinforced by some of the tax settings that we have here, like negative gearing concessions for property, and also the capital gains tax concession. Firstly, gearing is where you borrow money to buy an investment. So negative gearing in residential property, you take out a mortgage and you buy an investment property to get rental income. If you're negatively geared, it means that the income you're receiving from rent is less than the costs of taking out the mortgage and running the property. So the interest, the repairs, the council rates would be more than the rental income you're getting. The sweetener of negative gearing is that you can take that loss and reduce it from your taxable income, and that makes it easier for property investors to hold property and enjoy the juicy capital gains that they'll get from that over time, which again is just further sweetened by the capital gains tax discount. Capital gains tax is a tax on the profit you make from selling an asset. Controversially, Australia introduced a 50% capital gains tax discount in 1999. So for people buying investment properties, it means they were only taxed on half the profit that they made when it was accounted in their taxable income. It's something that encourages more investment in Australia's housing market, but it applies to all investment assets. It's basically become a little bit too generous and maybe created a a little too much interest from property investors. A lot of people say that back in the 2019 election, the Labor government lost because they tried to take a stance on negative gearing and the capital gains tax concession. We've moved on from 2019. Property values are 50% higher. More people are struggling in the rental market. And I think that's pressuring this government to pursue bolder reform on housing and how we tax investment property. Australia has a relatively high level of its wealth in housing. 2/3 of household wealth are in the housing asset. And that's high compared to countries like the US. It's closer to 1/3. The other thing is our banking system is really invested in housing as well. About 2/3 of lending in this country is for mortgage lending, and that's high relative to many countries internationally. I think we could be doing a lot more to generate wealth in other ways, to encourage people to invest in other ways that would maybe make us a more productive and interesting society. So there's all of these different problems on a spectrum of slightly inconvenient and more expensive rents to an absolute critical situation of consistently rising homelessness in this country. And housing crisis has kind of become a catch-all term for that. Fixing the housing crisis is about reversing this path that we've been on, where we treat housing more and more as an investment. We need to kind of move away from that and just frame housing as something to live in.